August 7, 1945. The summer heat hung over Tokyo like a shroud, oppressive and unmoving. Inside the Imperial Palace, behind walls that had stood for centuries, Emperor Hirohito sat in a chamber where light filtered through paper screens in pale, uncertain rays. The air smelled of tatami mats and incense, ancient and unchanging. Outside, the city bore the scars of fire, whole neighborhoods reduced to ash by months of B-29 raids, the wooden bones of buildings standing like charred skeletons against the sky. But this morning was different. The reports arriving at the palace spoke not of fire, but of something else entirely. Something that had no name in the language of war as Japan had known it. The word came first as a whisper, then as a roar that could not be contained. Hiroshima, a single bomb, an entire city erased. Not burned, not shattered by thousands of explosives dropped over hours, but obliterated in a flash of light that turned night into day, that vaporized shadows into stone, that left behind a silence so profound it seemed the earth itself had stopped breathing. The military commanders who delivered the news could not explain it. They stumbled over their words, their training failing them, because the vocabulary of conventional warfare had no place for this. 70,000 dead in an instant, buildings vanished, a river that boiled, survivors walking like ghosts, their skin hanging from their bodies like wet paper. Hirohito listened. He did not move. For years, he had been told that Japan's spirit would overcome American material strength, that bushido, the way of the warrior, would triumph over industrial might. The generals had promised him that the nation's fighting soul would endure, that the home islands would become a fortress where every man, woman, and child would resist to the death. They had spoken of honor, of sacrifice, of a glorious end rather than a shameful surrender. But now, sitting in that quiet room with reports of a weapon that defied comprehension scattered before him, the emperor faced a truth that cracked the foundation of everything he had been told. America had not simply built a better bomb, they had unlocked the power of the sun itself and wielded it as a sword. To understand what Hirohito felt in that moment, one must first understand what Japan believed about itself and its enemy. For nearly 4 years, the empire had fought a war of expansion across the Pacific, driven by a conviction that Japanese discipline, loyalty, and martial tradition made them superior to the decadent, materialistic West. American soldiers were said to be soft, their society weakened by luxury and democracy, their fighting spirit diluted by individualism. Japan's propaganda machine churned out images of a nation that would never surrender, of a people willing to die as one rather than accept defeat. The phrase 100 million souls for the emperor was not hyperbole, it was policy. Plans were already in motion for Operation Ketsu-Go, the final defense of the home islands, where civilians armed with bamboo spears would charge into American machine guns, where schoolgirls would strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves under tanks. The Japanese High Command knew the war was lost in any conventional sense. The Navy had been shattered at Midway, at Leyte Gulf, at the Philippine Sea. The army was scattered across a dying empire, cut off and starving on remote islands. American submarines had strangled Japan's merchant fleet, choking off the oil, steel, and food that sustained the war effort. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were burning one by one, systematically destroyed by fleets of B-29 superfortresses that flew in geometric formations, dropping incendiaries that turned wooden neighborhoods into infernos. Tokyo itself had been scorched in a single night the previous March, a firestorm that killed more than 100,000 people and left over 1 million homeless. The air smelled of ash for weeks. Yet still, the military leaders insisted on resistance. They argued that Japan could make the invasion of the home islands so costly, so drenched in American blood, that the United States would agree to a negotiated peace that preserved the emperor's throne and Japan's honor.
They pointed to Okinawa, where Japanese forces had killed nearly 50,000 Americans in 3 months of savage fighting, where kamikaze pilots had crashed their planes into ships with such frequency that the U.S. Navy dubbed the waters the Sea of Blood. If Okinawa was that terrible, they reasoned, imagine what 1 million defenders on Japan's main islands could do. The Americans would lose 500,000 men, their public would turn against the war, terms could be negotiated, the empire would survive, if not intact, then at least with dignity. Hirohito had heard these arguments. He had listened to his generals speak of inevitable victory through sacrifice, of the divine wind that would sweep away the invaders as it had centuries before against the Mongols. But he had also seen the reports they tried to hide from him, the ones that spoke of starvation in the cities, of factories with no workers and no materials, of an air force with planes but no fuel, of soldiers in the field eating grass and tree bark to survive. He knew what the generals would not say aloud. Japan was dying. The question was only whether it would die quickly or slowly, whether the death would be clean or agonizing.
And then came Hiroshima. The first reports were fragmentary, confused. A new type of bomb, massive destruction, details unclear. The Japanese military had no frame of reference for what had happened. They sent investigators, but the railroads were damaged, communication lines were down, and even when the first teams reached the outskirts of the city, they could not believe what they saw. Where Hiroshima had stood, there was now a flattened wasteland radiating out from a central point. Buildings made of reinforced concrete had been reduced to rubble. Metal had melted. Shadows of people who had been vaporized were burned into walls, the only evidence they had existed at all. The survivors who could still walk wandered in shock, their eyes vacant, their bodies marked by burns that doctors did not know how to treat. Many did not die immediately. They lingered for days, their hair falling out, bleeding from their gums and eyes, their organs dissolving from the inside. It was as if death itself had taken on a new form, something slow and invisible and inescapable. The scientists who examined the evidence were the first to understand. This was not a conventional explosive. The damage pattern, the thermal effects, the radiation sickness, it all pointed to something that should have been theoretical, something that existed only in physics journals and laboratory experiments. Nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom, a chain reaction that released energy on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had ever wielded. One bomb, one plane, one city. The calculations were staggering. The explosive yield was equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. 15,000 tons. To deliver that much destructive power conventionally would have required hundreds of B-29s flying dozens of sorties. America had compressed it into a single weapon, carried by a single aircraft, and dropped it with precision. When Hirohito was briefed on the true nature of the bomb, when the scientists explained to him in halting, careful language what atomic fission meant, something shifted behind his eyes. The emperor was a scholar, a man who had studied marine biology, who understood the scientific method. He grasped immediately what the generals could not or would not accept. This was not simply a new weapon, it was a new kind of power. America had not just won the arms race, they had transcended it. They had reached into the fabric of reality itself and pulled out a force that had previously belonged only to the stars. And if they had done it once, they could do it again and again and again. The symbolism was almost too cruel to bear. For years, Japan had defined itself by spiritual strength, by the purity of sacrifice, by the belief that will and honor could overcome material disadvantage. The kamikaze pilots who flew their planes into American ships believed they were becoming gods, that their sacrifice would turn the tide of war through sheer force of spirit. The soldiers who held out on Pacific Islands until they starved or killed themselves believed their deaths had meaning, that they were buying time for the homeland, that their example would inspire the nation to final victory. But the atomic bomb rendered all of that meaningless. No amount of courage could withstand it. No depth of sacrifice could answer it. A pilot could crash his plane into a carrier with perfect precision, giving his life in an act of supreme devotion, and achieve less than a single bomber flying too high to even be seen, releasing a single bomb that would fall silently until the moment it rewrote the landscape. August 9, 1945. 3 days after Hiroshima, before Japan had even fully grasped what had happened, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. Another city, another flash of light, another 40,000 dead in seconds. The message was unmistakable. America did not have just one of these weapons. They had more. They could do this every few days, methodically erasing Japan's cities one by one, until there was nothing left but radioactive rubble and the ghosts of a nation that had refused to surrender. In the Imperial Palace, the Supreme War Council convened in emergency session. The military leaders were divided. Some still argued for resistance, clinging to the belief that Japan could endure, that the Americans must be running out of these bombs, that a negotiated peace was still possible. But Hirohito had reached his conclusion. He had seen the photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had read the casualty estimates, had listened to the scientists explain that radiation would continue killing for weeks and months after the initial blast. He understood that this was not war as humans had practiced it for thousands of years. This was something new, something apocalyptic, a power that could erase not just armies, but entire populations, that could poison the land itself so that nothing would grow there for generations. The meeting stretched into the night of August 9th. The council was deadlocked, 3 in favor of surrender, 3 against, locked in an ideological battle that had no resolution. Japan's government required consensus, and consensus was impossible. As midnight approached and the deadlock persisted, Hirohito did something almost unprecedented. He spoke. The emperor, who by tradition remained above politics, who governed but did not rule, who embodied the divine but did not dictate policy, broke his silence. His voice was quiet, measured, almost gentle, but his words carried the weight of a decision that would reshape his nation's future. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The room fell silent. Some of the generals wept. Others stared at the floor, unable to meet their emperor's eyes. Hirohito continued, speaking of the unendurable that must be endured, of the unbearable that must be borne. He spoke of the atomic bomb, the new and most cruel bomb, and acknowledged that to continue fighting against such a weapon would lead not just to defeat, but to the extinction of the Japanese people and the destruction of human civilization itself. He used the phrase that would echo through history: "We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable." But there were other words spoken in private, that reveal even more about what Hirohito understood in that moment. In a conversation with one of his advisors, recorded in documents that would not become public for decades, the emperor said something that cuts to the heart of what the atomic bomb meant. "If we continue the war, Japan will altogether be destroyed. Although some of you are of the opinion that we cannot trust the words of the Americans, I believe that the enemy's intentions are clearly revealed in the Potsdam Declaration. I have examined every possible course of action, and I believe that continuing the war offers nothing but the annihilation of our people and the devastation of our nation." And then, in a moment of stark clarity, "They have created something that makes resistance itself meaningless. What is courage against the sun?" What is courage against the sun? The question haunted Japan in those final days before surrender. The atomic bomb was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a physical manifestation of the vast gulf that had opened between Japan's understanding of war and the reality America had created. For centuries, Japan had valued the sword, the blade that required skill and honor and closeness to the enemy. The samurai tradition celebrated personal combat, the discipline required to master a weapon, the ritual significance of death in battle.
Even in modern warfare, there was a sense that courage and sacrifice mattered, that a man's willingness to die for his cause could tip the balance, that spirit could overcome material disadvantage if the spirit was pure enough.
The atomic bomb shattered that worldview. It killed indiscriminately, without regard for courage or cowardice, honor or shame. A general and a child died the same death, vaporized in an instant, or dying slowly from radiation poisoning. There was no opportunity for glory, no chance to prove one's worth. The bomb fell from a height too great to engage, carried by a plane moving too fast to intercept, released by a crew who would never see the faces of those they killed. It was war reduced to pure mathematics, to calculations of yield and blast radius and thermal effects. It was death delivered by physics, by the cold, impersonal forces of nuclear chain reaction. And more than that, it was uniquely American in its scale and ambition. Japan's war machine had been built on discipline and sacrifice, on doing more with less, on soldiers who would fight to the death rather than surrender. But America had fought a different war entirely. They had outproduced Japan so completely that the disparity became grotesque. By 1945, the United States was building one aircraft carrier every month, launching ships so fast that they ran out of names and started recycling them. They produced more oil in a single day than Japan had imported in a year before the war. Their factories churned out tanks, planes, ships, guns, ammunition in quantities that seemed impossible. A single American Ford plant produced more military hardware than all of Italy's industry combined. But the atomic bomb was something else. It was not mass production. It was the weaponization of pure knowledge, the transformation of theoretical physics into practical apocalypse. It required not just factories, but laboratories, not just workers, but scientists, not just steel and oil, but uranium refined to impossible purity, calculations performed to microscopic precision, engineering feats that pushed the boundaries of what humans had ever attempted. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion, equivalent to tens of billions today, and employed over 100,000 people, most of whom had no idea what they were building. It was the triumph of American industrial capacity married to American scientific genius, a demonstration that the nation that had seemed soft and decadent to Japanese propagandists had instead created something that made traditional military power obsolete. In the days following Hirohito's decision to surrender, there was chaos. Army officers attempted a coup, trying to seize the Imperial Palace and prevent the emperor's surrender message from being broadcast. They failed, but not without bloodshed, and their failure revealed how deeply the shock of the atomic bomb had split the Japanese leadership. Some could not accept that their ideals of honor and sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by American technology. They would rather die fighting than admit that the war they had believed in was a lie, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, that their enemy had been so far ahead that catching up was never even possible. But Hirohito understood. On August 15, 1945, his voice crackled over radios across Japan, the first time most of his subjects had ever heard him speak. He did not use the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of accepting the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration, of preserving the nation for future generations, of enduring the unendurable. But his meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. And the reason, stated explicitly, was the atomic bomb. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. The broadcasts ended. Across Japan, people wept or stood in stunned silence, or felt a wave of relief that the dying could finally stop. In Tokyo, in the shadow of the Imperial Palace where Hirohito had made his decision, the air still smelled of ash from the firebombing raids. But now there was something else in the air, a sense that the world had changed in some fundamental way, that a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. War had always been terrible, but it had operated within certain understood parameters. Soldiers killed soldiers, cities were besieged or bombed, but the destruction unfolded over time,
giving people a chance to flee, to hide, to survive. The atomic bomb changed all of that. It was instantaneous, total, and it made no distinctions. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes, the memory of those two bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became woven into the nation's identity in a way that shaped everything that came after. Japan would become a pacifist nation, its constitution renouncing war forever. It would become a technological power in its own right, channeling the same discipline and innovation that once built warplanes into creating industries that would dominate global markets. But it would never again seek to challenge America militarily. The lesson of the atomic bomb had been learned too well. Some wars cannot be won through courage or sacrifice. Some powers cannot be overcome through will alone. Hirohito lived for 4 more decades after the war, watching his nation transform from empire to democracy, from aggressor to ally, from ruins to economic miracle. He never spoke publicly in detail about his decision to surrender, about what he felt when he learned the true power of the atomic bomb. But those who knew him, who served in his court and recorded his private thoughts, said that he carried the weight of that decision until his death. He had been told his entire life that he was divine, that he embodied the spirit of Japan itself, that his people would die for him without hesitation. And then he had been forced to acknowledge that divinity had no answer to uranium-235, that the spirit of a nation could not withstand the splitting of an atom, that courage meant nothing when your enemy could vaporize your cities from the stratosphere. What Hirohito said when he learned the atomic bomb's true power was not a single phrase or dramatic declaration. It was a slow, painful realization that unfolded over days and months and years. It was the understanding that the war Japan had chosen to fight was unwinnable from the moment it began, because the nation they had attacked had resources and capabilities so vast that comparison was meaningless. It was the recognition that honor and sacrifice, the values Japan had built its entire military tradition upon, were no match for a country that could harness the fundamental forces of the universe and turn them into weapons.
But perhaps most profoundly, what Hirohito said, what he truly understood in those dark days of August 1945, was that the world had changed forever. The atomic bomb was not just the end of one war, it was the end of an era in which nations could believe that superior spirit or fighting will or willingness to sacrifice could overcome industrial and scientific advantage. It was the beginning of a new age in which the power to destroy had become so absolute that using it meant mutual annihilation, in which the only winning move was not to play. In the quiet of the Imperial Palace, in the days after the surrender, Hirohito is said to have looked at a single photograph of Hiroshima, the flattened wasteland, the skeletal remains of buildings, the shadows burned into stone. He held it for a long time, saying nothing, and then, to an aide who recorded the moment, he spoke words that captured the essence of what the atomic bomb meant. "This is not war. This is the end of the world, held back by one man's decision not to drop another bomb." He paused, still looking at the photograph, at the proof of what America could do and had chosen to do, and what they could have kept doing until Japan was nothing but a radioactive memory. "We were never fighting a war we could win," he said finally. "We were fighting a nation that had learned to hold the sun in its hands, and they showed us mercy by not squeezing." The photograph remained on his desk for the rest of his life, a reminder of the day Japan learned that courage alone was not enough, that honor could not stop the splitting atom, that the future belonged to those who could master not just the sword, but the fundamental forces of creation itself. The sun rose and set over Tokyo as it always had, but after August 1945, everyone who looked up at it knew that humans had learned to recreate that fire, that blinding light, that terrible power, and the nation that had done it first had proven, in 2 terrible flashes, that the age of empires built on warrior spirit and willingness to die had ended forever. In its place rose something new, a world in which the ultimate weapon was not courage or sacrifice, but knowledge, and America had shown, in the most decisive way imaginable, that they possessed both the knowledge to create the atomic bomb and the restraint to stop using it after Japan surrendered. That combination, overwhelming power paired with the choice not to wield it unto extinction, may have been the most profound demonstration of American strength in the entire war. Not the ability to destroy, but the decision of when to stop destroying. Hirohito understood, and in understanding he made the choice that saved his nation from annihilation. He endured the unendurable, he bore the unbearable. He surrendered not because Japan's spirit had broken, but because he recognized that spirit alone was not enough when your enemy had learned to split atoms and harness the power of stars. That recognition, that moment of terrible clarity when he learned what the atomic bomb truly was, marked not just the end of World War II, but the end of an entire philosophy of war. What courage could mean against the sun, he had asked. The answer, written in the ruins of two cities, was clear: nothing at all.